Hello, my name is Alex Johnson, and welcome back to our limited series Fintech Takes podcast, What Customers Want. This podcast series is sponsored by Ubiquity, and I'm delighted to be co-hosting it with Corey Besaw, president of APAC and one of the co-founders of Ubiquity. In episode 1, Corey and I talked about the complicated relationship that fintech has with customer service and how smart fintech companies engineer their customer service processes to create value and competitive differentiation for their brands. In this episode, episode 2, we take those ideas and we drill down a level deeper to find out how they're actually being operationalized in the market. In this episode, Corey and I talk with Marcus Vinson. Marcus's current job is risk management at Lithic, but prior to joining Lithic, Marcus spent 6 years at Chime doing fraud and dispute management. In fact, Marcus was the first full-time fraud manager at Chime, so he has incredible perspective on what it takes to build and scale up customer support teams, processes, and systems. As you'll hear in our discussion, it's not easy. Providing customer support in a highly regulated industry is an optimization problem with many different and constantly changing constraints. Arriving at the best possible end state requires a clear understanding of your goals, picking performance metrics that make sense, and applying automation in a way that creates consistency and enables scale while preserving the human elements that make customer service such a rewarding job. So, without further ado, I present episode 2 of What Customers Want. Okay, well, Corey, thanks for coming back and joining me as a co-host for our second episode. Great to see you again.
Thanks, Alex.
We have an absolutely delightful episode, as I hinted at in the intro, and we're just delighted, Marcus, to have you join in as well. This is the first time that you and I think, are speaking face-to-face, so to speak, though not the first time for you and Corey, certainly. Thank you for joining the podcast. We really appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Absolutely. This is a topic that both of you know oceans full amount of content on. I have a thimbleful, so I'll try not to get in the way too much. But Corey, why don't you just jump in with the next question?
So you were the first full-time fraud manager hired at Chime back in 2017, which for the listeners, we had worked together. Ubiquity is one of Chime's partners. So Marcus and I had the opportunity to work together really closely back then. Can you take us back to those days, Marcus, and describe a little bit about what it was like? How did customer service at Chime work back then for you?
Yeah. In the earliest days, like customer service was very much a mix of like our own internal team. Like we actually had a team of folks engaging and handling customer support issues and contacts like locally at the office, and then a mix of like BPO agents actually handling a lot of like phone calls and email and chat support, and but like the ratio there was definitely like the on-site to BPO agents was definitely a lot higher than in the later days, and there was a lot of like heavy, just like near real-time coordination between those teams, either because there were specific issues that were that had to be escalated up, either just from like a decision authority perspective and ensuring we had the right controls over at what point like certain exceptions could be made to existing policies or procedures, or even just in getting insight in terms of like what types of contacts we were getting and how those were trending, or if like some sort of incident happened, like ensuring that everyone like had very quick and consistent alignment on not just like the type of treatment that we wanted to offer customers, but even just like expectation setting. And yeah, in the earlier days, I mean, it was very much a lot of just near real-time coordination on things, as broad reaching from, hey, how are queues trending? What does productivity look like? To, hey, like we're seeing like some sort of incident happen that's impacting either one form of like the user experience or another, and here's how we're resolving it, and how to educate the customers appropriately, and then to what extent post incident like there was any necessary cleanup. So it was very like it was like a lot less like structured, I guess I would say, like a little more chaotic on some days.
Yep.
But I think one of the things that the team did a really great job of was like their approach to labeling those contacts, right? With the like just building out taxonomies for resolutions so that we could understand, once the flurry and chaos of an incident died down, like how that actually impacted not just contact volumes, but the types of contacts, and then you could then feed that into like the actual satisfaction surveys you were getting to understand, to what extent not just an incident like impacted that, but even how just over the normal course of business, the customer contact trends and sentiment trends were changing.
That's really interesting because I think one of the things that we all talked about offline a little bit before we started recording was just this idea that a lot of this relates to like data, right? And the data that you're measuring, what you're trying to understand, the sort of signals you're getting, and to your point about like incidents and customer satisfaction, like how you contextualize those signals so that you're actually learning from them and like understanding what they actually mean. And the reason I am curious to kind of dig into that is I'm guessing, and correct me if I'm wrong here, that in the early days, at a smaller scale, a lot of that can be done somewhat manually or somewhat by hand. You might be optimizing more for kind of the qualitative than the quantitative, because you're operating at a small scale, as people like to say, like, do things that don't scale for very early stage startups. But then, and for anyone who's been following fintech, they'll be familiar with this journey from an outside perspective. Chime grows very quickly, right? And I think I saw on your LinkedIn that in the first 3 to 4 years when you were at Chime, number of customers grew by like 4,000% or more, which is just an insane growth trajectory. Although, again, something we've all noticed from the outside as well. I'm curious from the inside, how did you handle that? Like when you were thinking about building systems or building processes or making adjustments, as you were saying, to kind of that mix of internal versus business process outsourcing, like how did you approach dealing with that scale? What changed?
Yeah, I think we were like relatively early on. A lot of the team realized the need to start just investing in structure, right, and ensuring that you were able to like deliver consistency. Because while as fun as kind of like the early firefighting days can be, and as energizing as that can feel sometimes, like in financial services, like variability and like disparate treatments can be a material risk, and
Totally.
right. And you want to ensure, especially when you're talking about like disputes and fraud, that that consistency, especially from a customer like treatment and like fraud risk prevention and mitigation and resolution perspective, that is as consistent and as effective as possible. And so relatively early on, we started trying to invest in not just on the support side of the house, but on the back end side of the house. How do we develop kind of the systems and processes that allow for that standardization, and like setting up kind of a common set of KPIs that you could really use to understand across experience, loss, accuracy, and quality, like how the program was performing. And not just for our own benefit, but like, I mean, there were several stakeholders that that needed consistent alignment on and updates on the state of those metrics, not just at like the BPO partnerships, so that you all maintain alignment on like an agreement on like what is good performance and where like areas need to improve, but even when talking to bank partners or anyone else, or if there's like an actual processing error, right? Like being able to communicate and align on that with whoever your issuer processor is. So like a lot of that standardization definitely helped with maturing, even though it still felt a lot of times like we weren't as mature or as standardized as we could be. I think having that kind of like baseline framework of from like I call it like a classification and outcome taxonomy perspective, like how to drive that treatment. Like once you've identified the classification taxonomy, like that then informs the process, and then the outcome obviously can help you understand insights into those like 4 parent metrics I mentioned.
I would add to that, by the way, that, I think my experience has definitely been that as startups begin to scale, they can really struggle to understand and describe what success looks like. So to your point, Marcus, by really understanding like what are the outcomes that matter and how do we measure those things, how do we label them, it's so important. And I think as something scales, and certainly scales as quickly as Chime did, if you don't get that right, it can become kind of impossible to manage an operation. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so, right? Because you just leave a lot more up to interpretation, or up to unless you're designing that like that system that helps like classify and label things appropriately, then you're not getting a lot of the insight and feedback that you need to understand. Okay, hey, here are like a combination of events and data points that I can leverage, not just to improve something, right? Like, so if to your point, like if something is underperforming or there's an area of opportunity within some like segment of that customer experience space, like you're vulnerable to blind spots more consistently, that that may end up in like showing up in like customer complaint data instead of your actual like operational data. And then if the customer complaint data is where it's presenting first, then you're already behind the 8 ball in terms of being able to answer to the bank partners and the regulators as to the magnitude and frequency of a problem.
Yeah, that's a great point too. That, I would say the last place that you want to learn about a new problem is from a regulator or maybe your issuing bank. In the case of Fintech, you never want to be asked that question and be kind of thinking to yourself like, wow, I have never even heard about this before, because that's going to be a problem for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think the other thing I'm curious about, and again, this is me, the outsider, sort of asking you guys about what you do every day, but I am really curious to dig a little bit more into the sort of balance between business process outsourcing and in-house customer support. And I think the thing I'm most curious about is, obviously, I mean, it sounds like Chime was very on top of it even from the early days and trying to figure out the right resourcing model that would work. And then certainly as you scale up, that puts sort of a different strain on every part of the operation. But I'm curious, what are some of the best practices, Marcus, from your perspective? And, Corey, please jump in on this too, since this is what you guys do, in terms of engaging with business process outsourcing, even like evaluating who you want to work with. Like what were some of the lessons learned from those early experiences?
Yeah, I mean, It's another area where like establishing and investing in the right partnerships, and even just going through, to your point, like the right like vetting process can be really crucial. I think a lot of folks have talked about that within the confines of like finding bank partners, and I think the same thing goes for a BPO, because I think a lot of like BPO companies have their own like areas of specialty. They have their own unique value propositions and their own unique approaches to how they deliver excellence in their respective areas. And it's really important to understand where that alignment between like your own company priorities and the aspirations that you want for your customer support program align, as well as where like a BPO's just like operational strengths align with the type of support that you need. So like that was one of the things relatively early on that uh, I found was really important. Like not all BPOs are the same, and a lot of them offer like varied, although very important to unique segments of their client base, like values and benefits. But a BPO that's good for one fintech company may be a really poor fit, and then really like really struggle to perform up to expectations. Because there's just a fundamental misalignment from either a competencies or a priorities or it's like strategy perspective. Like that was one of the earlier things. I think there's always, every company also just has a consistent kind of reevaluation of what makes sense to partner with a BPO on versus not. There's a lot of, I think, obviously beyond just the customer experience aspect of it, there's like budgetary and just like capacity constraints. And so I think really setting out like what those constraints are and just like being transparent with yourself as a company of like what our priorities are and the outcomes that we want can help inform that partnership and like BPO versus in-house staffing like strategy.
One thing I might just to kind of build upon that, if when I kind of think about what you said in the early days, having an internal team and the benefits of that, being able to kind of iterate quickly on process, that makes a lot of sense, right? And I think that's what a lot of startups generally, certainly fintechs, but startups of all types go through, right? Because you're not going to sit around and spend months and months and months of resource time trying to consider every possible scenario that might come up. And even if you tried to do that, there's a lot of things that you would miss. So that's kind of a necessary part of the process. I think one of the things that can happen when working with a BPO, and certainly there are a lot of startups that never build their own internal team, right? They start kind of from day one working with a BPO. I think that's possible to do, certainly. I've done that firsthand and I've seen it work, but I've also seen where it doesn't work. And I think one of the critical things is to set the right expectations. And I think, Marcus, to your point, the what's needed sort of at a small scale is different than what's needed at a medium scale, and that's different still than what's needed at a large scale. The way that you operate, the type of staff that's required, the way that staff is managed, it's all different. And, I think too often if people don't kind of think it through when they engage with a BPO, it's just like, I need 10 people, hire 10 people for me. But, the key is it's got to be the right 10 people with the right expectations. What does success look like in this engagement and how are they going to be managed? Because the 10 people that are the right people for a startup to iterate quickly on processes, that's a different 10 people than a very stable set of processes, and something that's scaling, right? And I think it's just such an important distinction that, people who maybe don't have as much experience on the operation side kind of overlook that difference.
Yeah, I agree with that 100%. I mean, I think there can sometimes be this like misconception around like BPO partnerships of it being kind of like a set it and forget it kind of thing, or like to your point, I don't have the time, or I just don't want to invest in building this out in house, and so I'm just going to go find someone to do it for me. And um, I think one of the biggest value adds of a BPO is capacity. There's no doubt about that. But there's still a lot of um, investment that you have to make in alignment on process and alignment on like uh, experience expectations, and then to your point, Corey, like over time, as that partnership and as the team grows, um, there's more that you're going to have to invest in, from like a change management and a training and a quality and performance management perspective. Um, and so that's why I tell folks, like, yeah, in the early days, if you can find the right hire, right, that can grow with with your company, right, and kind of be that like operational jack of all trades, like you can get by with that for a time, but eventually, like if you as your program grows, you're going to need to make incremental investments in some of these other operational specialties, like even if you continue that BPO model, um, and and so like that's something I think that's one of the things that I learned even firsthand was like at first we literally had two people handling all of our internally, focused on a lot of uh, our dispute and fraud lines of business. But then over time, right, we had to bring on folks that had a deeper like process and change management skill set, and folks that were like very adept in training and quality assurance and communications, so that again, as you continue to grow and scale, you can apply more structure and like more like guardrails and just like growth levers to facilitate that operational maturity. Um, because like you said, like what you and your partner need at, let's say, a 20 agent team, is very different and far less resource intensive than when you hit 100 or 200 or 500 BPO agents. And just like the frequency of alignment and investment and just like further kind of like continuity and growth planning, right? It just becomes additional work that you have to continue to perform.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I want to dig specifically into the fraud and dispute management stuff because, as you mentioned, two people on the team at first kind of just owning this by themselves, which must have been a wild experience. I think the reason it's so interesting to me is that fraud and dispute management is one of those areas that I think really distinguishes providing customer support in financial services from customer support in almost any other realm. And obviously, Marcus, you know this better than any of us. So maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview just on kind of how fraud and dispute management works at a high level. And then, what are some of the kind of inherent things that make it challenging to manage?
Yeah, I mean, I am just like a very data-driven person, and so like I think fraud, in particular, is very much kind of like a data game for especially in the early days when capacity is like very highly constrained, right? And so
Sure.
it's really important in the early days to set up a lot of that kind of like anomaly and exception reporting to help you understand and set baselines on like what you consider, according to the products and services you offer, and like the normal expectations of your client base, like where things could potentially start to be moving from like green to yellow from a patterns perspective, and where you can find kind of like those exceptions, those anomalies, and cue in on them quickly. The dispute side, I think, has a very heavy fraud element to it. Not just because obviously like disputes includes things like unauthorized transfers or transactions, but I mean, I think everyone has recognized at this point that like first party fraud is a prevalent issue within the dispute space. And so honestly, it's why like that, the complexity of that problem, I think, is what I really enjoyed, and why I spent a lot of time deep in that space. And that's where having, again, a really strong alignment on like the combination of features and factors and information that within the scope of that dispute investigation process, like leads you to that like true fraud versus first party fraud decision outcome, and being able to really structure and deliver consistency in that process is crucial. I mean, in the very early days, like, it was because you don't have as much capacity, or is because you're handling only a handful of disputes a week, you're able to get by with more like unstructured judgmental decisioning because you have consensus across your small but mighty team over how to interpret these signals, right? But like you need a lot more standardization and documentation and structure in order to scale that. And so that was something that was really critical to invest in and acquire alignment on, not just internally, but I mean, since you're a fintech program, like you have to have very close and early alignment on those definitions with your bank sponsor as well, because they are going to drive that alignment one way or another. And it's a lot easier and efficient for you to be proactive in that process. Similar to the complaints discussion item before, like bank partners are going to test and sample your operation, and whether they do it on an annual, quarterly, monthly, whatever basis. And so, at some point, if there is a misalignment, it's going to arise in that testing program. And it's far better to drive alignment proactively and through your partnerships and through collaboration than it is through an unexpected piece of feedback from the bank that is critical enough that it then requires a full look back on your operations that you performed in the past, that can then also lead to like unexpected losses, because that like what the bank sees as something that is true fraud, based on their definition, but you thought otherwise, could ultimately end up impacting your bottom line in an unexpected way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm glad you mentioned the bank component to it, and obviously compliance and relationships with sponsor banks. I mean, that's a huge component of this as well, because as we've seen recently with banking as a service, you don't want to get run over by the train, right? Like the train is going to come through regardless of sort of how you're aligned with it. And it can be very bad and very disruptive to businesses. So that idea of being well aligned with your sponsor bank and with understanding, I imagine, like their requirements as well and the compliance obligations that they're under is incredibly important. It leads me, Marcus, to another question I had for you, which is towards the end of your time at Chime, it seems as though you sort of transition to being more responsible at kind of a more global level for thinking about designing systems, designing processes, thinking about the roadmap for things that were going to be coming in the future. And I'm curious sort of how your experience and how your viewpoint on this stuff changed when you did take more of that kind of global view of like thinking about it in terms of systems, thinking about, as we're talking about, how those systems need to overlap or intersect with the systems that your sponsor banks used and that their regulatory supervisors will be coming in and asking them questions about. So can you give us a little bit of a perspective on, from that more systems view, sort of how you thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, like we made like I'm really fortunate, I think, because we made the strategic decision to invest heavily in a pretty robust like system across the dispute ecosystem, and so like from day one, we had actually, like when we were starting to like brainstorm and scope and define like goals and outcomes, we actually like created a specific persona like for our bank partners, like because we had like, okay, like, here are our frontline agents, this is the functionality and experience and features that they're going to need. Here is this like the actual supervisors and the functionality and features and how we're going to need to enable them. And we took a similar approach to bank partners, and understanding that like they're going to need access to the dispute records and being able to see like the full life cycle of that dispute and understand how it came to the outcome it did, either because it's part of like their monthly testing or because they received a complaint directly from a customer, because that's inevitably going to happen, right? And so from just a roles and permissioning and functionality perspective, like we went and actually defined that functionality, and then even in understanding, okay, this is what bank partner A versus bank partner B needs, and to ensure that we had the right access and enablement for those partners, while also ensuring like the right controls existed. And then we also went through that exercise to help us understand to what extent can the system help enforce or drive consistency in the process and the experience, right? And so, like the fun element of disputes is it touches a lot of your entire enterprise systems, everything from like customer communications platforms to like money movement to your accounts and your transaction and like ledgering, and so we had to think through not just how does the system itself enforce the process, but like how do we integrate with these the various systems across the business to automate a lot of like what was traditionally performed manually in these operations, again with an eye towards scale and consistency. Because I mean, I remember in the really early days we were seeing like compliance violations due to like manual errors, either in application of funds or like sending the right specific communication to a customer, which just like felt like owned goals in a way. And so, because we had the opportunity and made the strategic decision to invest in like building this, we had the opportunity to eliminate a lot of that, those manual operations, because, once the the system through the agent reached a certain step in that process, like it handled the administrative side of the house, which then also, from an agent experience perspective, allows them to just focus on, it's judgmental decisioning and like the fun part of the job, right? Like no one wants to sit and just click through a bunch of buttons and manually enter some numbers, right? Like the fun part is the investigation itself and like coming to that decision within the scope of that process. And so like that was one of the things we invested heavily, is like where things are deterministic or where we can trigger an automation through a separate endpoint to another piece of our ecosystem, like let's invest in that upfront, because of the downstream efficiency and customer experience and compliance implications.
I would say for anyone listening, like to me, that's probably one of the best pieces of advice that anyone that's kind of setting up a program like this could receive, which is to say, think about how to automate everything that you reasonably can. And for disputes in particular, boil it down to decision making, right? There's no benefit in having someone manually go to 7 different systems to just gather the basic facts that they need to make a decision. If you can automate that and present all of that information, all the better. And, I love the own goals statement. I agree with that too, right? And certainly, if someone's made a decision, whether it's to grant a claim or to deny a claim, there's a certain set of actions that are going to happen. There might be money movements, there's letters to be sent, et cetera. Again, those can easily be automated. And, to me, the thing that I always try to remind everything about is that there's always going to be a level of human error in everything, right? And the level of human error isn't going to be on a per case basis. It's going to be on a per action basis, right? And that's an important distinction. And if within one case, whatever that a case might mean, whether it's a dispute or something else, if someone's performing 30 or 50 or 70 different discrete actions, that's 30 or 50 or 70 or 100 discrete, opportunities to make a mistake. And it drives up the likelihood of an error being made on the case level considerably, right? So one of the smartest things you can do, in addition to preventing like regulatory violations or something else, improving productivity as well, but just in the sense of if you're trying to get to the right outcome the greatest percentage of the time, well, one of the best ways you can do that is to make the number of manual actions that get taken in that case as small as you possibly can.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense to me. I'm taking notes as you guys are talking. This is me just like drafting off of all the smart things you're saying, but the application of automation to reduce the opportunities for like action level errors is really, really good point. And I think, one thing I'd like to maybe direct back to you, Marcus, is I do think I love the way you're describing the job, right? Because the fun part, I think, is a thing that maybe we don't think about enough in some of this stuff. But like there is a really fun part of the job in terms of doing the investigation, trying to figure out what happened, and then trying to exercise the judgment part of the job, which the company wants you to do and is paying you to do, in a way that's going to balance out all of those outcomes. And I guess as we wrap up, a thing I'm kind of curious to get your maybe kind of larger picture take on, because you are a longtime practitioner in this space, is how do you think that is sort of changing or evolving? And the context that I see from the outside is that obviously, and you were at Chime while this was happening, the pandemic has changed, I think, a lot of stuff in terms of customer behavior, just the usage of all of these different digital financial apps and digital payments, as well as, I think, kind of a more subtle shift in behavior around things like friendly fraud. Obviously, scams have really exploded kind of during and after the pandemic. And it's I think, putting a lot of pressure on everyone in the ecosystem to maybe reevaluate some of the assumptions they have built into these processes. So not that you're in the job anymore necessarily at Chime, but just like when you think about it globally, what's your perspective on kind of how things are changing and how you might want to think about adapting to that?
Yeah, I think like earlier investment in a lot of the like use and like utilization of those data sources that I think you typically waited on investing in, is just a necessity now, right? Because scams and first party fraud and just like the crowdsourcing of vulnerabilities is become so prevalent that, while in 2017 or 2018, you could probably get by without being noticed for quite some time. It's just a lot because of the prevalence, the magnitude and likelihood of that risk materializing is greater and at an earlier stage of your company's journey. And so I think, especially for consumer-focused companies, like there's just a need to invest more heavily in a lot of the behavioral and like biometric and fingerprinting data sources, whether they are your own or if you're acquiring through like third parties, like earlier in that company's journey, to mitigate a lot of those fraud risks. And unfortunately, dispute fraud continues to be kind of a low-hanging fruit like vector. And I think everyone in the ecosystem, including the card networks, are trying to do something about it. But for right now, I think, if you are on the issuing side of that fintech ecosystem, you are literally the front line because you're the one that's getting these things. And so it takes a lot more effort, right, to proactively identify that, at that first contact or at that investigation stage, as opposed to, after the third, fifth, 10th dispute that's come through. And really, it's just way more difficult than it used to be to discern between like true fraud and first party fraud. And of course, and then like, I really hope at some point a bit clearer guidance on scam treatment is going to come out. I think everyone is doing the best they can within the confines of their legal counsel's advice on scam treatment. I've talked to a lot of like fintech risk folks, and a lot of them just either they get different advice or there's just a different business decision on how to treat it. And but it's something else I don't think will ever go away. And again, like, there's just a ton of noise, even within the scam contacts and cases over like what's legitimate and what's not, before you even reach that judgmental decisioning step of, as a business, what do we want to set? What expectation do we want to set for our customers, and what treatment do we want to administer to our customers? When they become victims. And I've seen it vary even within just the type of scam, right? Like providing treatment A for employee impersonation scams versus treatment B for like investment scams. And I think, again, everyone's just trying to apply their best judgment. But having earlier, more consistent access to that behavioral data is going to be crucial.
Absolutely. That I think is a great place to leave it. Marcus, Corey, thank you both. This was so fun. I learned a ton. Hopefully our audience did as well. And Corey, we'll be back at it for episode 3. So can't wait to do that with you as well.
Thanks, Alex. And thanks, Marcus. It's always great to talk to you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. This was fun.
Thanks for tuning in to What Customers Want. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and leave a review. We'll be back next Thursday with more insights on what truly matter to customers. See you then.